All right, let's dive into the world of Norse mythology. This is Jennifer and Thomas, ready for a deep dive into all those fascinating gods and goddesses.
Sounds like a plan.
Perfect. So I've got this great source material, a concise guide, to kind of quickly get us up to speed. It really is a complex and fascinating world, wouldn't you say?
It really is.
Yeah.
But you know what strikes me? How much these figures, these gods, they really tell us about how the Vikings saw the world, their whole worldview. Like you have gods of wisdom, war, love.
Right. And the source mentions over 30 gods. That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, that's a lot to keep track of.
So where do we even begin with all this?
Well, I think starting with the most famous ones makes sense.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Odin, Thor, Loki. Those names, even people who don't know much about Norse mythology, they've heard those names. They're kind of at the heart of a lot of the coolest stories. Good entry point.
Sounds good. So let's start with Odin. Everyone knows him as the All-Father. But what does that even mean, like in the context of Norse mythology?
Yeah, it's more than just being a dad, you know.
Right.
He's the king of the gods, right? He rules from Asgard. And he's connected to wisdom, war, death, poetry.
Wow. That's quite the mix.
Yeah, but I think it shows how connected the Vikings saw all these different parts of life in the universe.
Like they didn't see them as separate things like we might today.
Yeah, exactly. And think about this. Odin was so thirsty for knowledge, he sacrificed his eye to drink from this well, the well of Erd, the source of all wisdom.
Wow. That's some serious dedication to learning.
Right. Shows you how much they valued knowledge.
Okay, let's move on to Thor. Everyone pictures him, right? The thunder god, big hammer, Mjolnir.
Yeah, Mjolnir. Can't forget that.
But the source mentions he had 3 major treasures. What were the others?
Yeah, they kind of like boosted his power even more, right?
Right.
So besides Mjolnir, he had this magical belt, Megingjörn. It doubled his strength, which was already pretty strong.
Wow. So giants didn't stand a chance.
And then there were his iron gauntlets, Yarndraper. Without those, he couldn't even hold Mjolnir.
Oh, so those weren't just for show then. Essential gear.
Totally essential. He needed those to protect Asgard, to protect humans.
Speaking of essential, what about Loki? Can't leave him out.
Trickster god.
Yeah, always causing chaos. But he seems like more than just a troublemaker. Like, he actually drives the plot in a lot of these stories.
Oh, absolutely. He's always challenging everyone, you know, pushing boundaries, moral boundaries.
So he's kind of crucial to the whole thing, even though he's a trickster.
He is, and I think that's what's so great about Norse mythology. The characters are complex. Like, it's not just good guys and bad guys.
Everything's connected, kind of messy, like real life.
Exactly. It's not simple, like the world itself.
Okay, so we've got our big 3. Odin, the wise ruler, Thor, the protector, and Loki, the, well, you know, the wild card. But there's so many other gods in this pantheon.
Oh, tons.
Who should we meet next in this divine drama?
Well, how about we delve into some of the stories of, let's say, Baldur, Freya, Frigg, Heimdall, and Tyr. They all play big roles in these stories. Give us even more insight into how Vikings saw the world.
Right, sounds good. Baldur. His name always makes me think of something tragic. Like there's a sad story there. What makes him so important?
Well, everyone loved Baldur. He was like the good guy, beautiful and wise, kind. But he had this weakness, you see.
Oh, weakness. What was it?
Only mistletoe could harm him.
Mistletoe. That seems random.
But that's where the story gets interesting. You see, Loki, well, he tricked everyone.
Oh, no.
And Baldur ends up dying.
That's awful.
It is. And mistletoe, that tiny little plant, it emphasizes this big idea in Norse mythology, fate.
Fate.
Yeah, like no matter what you do, some things are just meant to be. Frigg, Baldur's mother, she got everyone to promise they wouldn't hurt him. Everything, every rock, tree, animal.
But she forgot mistletoe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even though she tried so hard, fate, well, you can't escape it.
So Baldur's death, it's not just a sad story. It's like a sign of something bigger.
You got it. It foreshadows Ragnarok, the big apocalyptic battle.
Oh, wow. Okay, on to Freya. She's like one of the most popular goddesses, right?
Very popular.
Why is she so fascinating?
Well, she represents female power and freedom, which is pretty cool considering this is a warrior culture.
Yeah, that's a good point.
She's the goddess of love, beauty, magic, fertility, even war. She's independent, strong, and connected to the Valkyries.
Oh, wow, the Valkyries, the ones who decide who lives or dies in battle.
Exactly. And I remember reading something about her connection to Vidar, That's a type of magic. Did you know that?
See, darn, no, I don't think so. What's that all about?
It was this Norse magic, mostly practiced by women. And Freya, she was a master of it. Showed how powerful and wise she was, like way beyond traditional roles.
So she's kind of a rebel in a way.
In a way, yeah. She even had this magical cloak made of feathers, let her shapeshift into a falcon.
That's pretty cool. A goddess who can fly, escape limitations. So we've got Baldur, who represents fate, and Freya, who's all about power and breaking free. It's like Norse mythology explores all these different sides of life.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And now, for someone completely different, how about Frigg, Odin's wife?
Oh, right. The Queen of Asgard.
Exactly. She's usually linked to motherhood, marriage, but there's more to her than that. She's also connected to fate and sorrow, especially because of her son, Baldur.
Because of his death and everything.
Yeah. She knew it was going to happen, but she couldn't stop it. It's like she represents the joys and sorrows of being a mom, and how sometimes, even though you're wise, fate has other plans.
Okay, that makes sense. And Heimdall. He's always depicted with horn, Jallarhorn. What's the significance of that?
That horn is super important. It signals the beginning of Ragnarok.
I know that, but what about his regular job, like watching over everything?
He's the watchman of the gods. He guards the Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge to Asgard.
The Rainbow Bridge, wow.
And he can see for miles, hear everything, even like the grass growing.
Really? That's incredible. So the horn represents that vigilance.
Exactly. Like, even when things are good, you got to be ready for the big challenges. Like Ragnarok, always be prepared.
Makes sense. Okay, what about Tyr? He's a god of war, but not quite like Thor, right? He's known for his bravery and justice. Didn't he sacrifice his hand to Fenrir, that monstrous wolf?
You know your Norse mythology?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was Tyr. He put his hand in Fenrir's mouth. It was a pledge, you see, when they were binding the wolf.
That's intense. So it shows his dedication to keeping order, to protecting the gods.
Absolutely. Even if it means a huge personal sacrifice.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. The major players, it feels like. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Just the beginning. There are tons more gods and goddesses, each with their own stories and symbols. We can think of it like a puzzle. Each piece tells us something about the Vikings' world.
I like that analogy. So what's the next piece of the puzzle? Where do we go from here?
Well, love and marriage, those are big parts of life, right?
Definitely.
But so are conflict and justice. How about we look at those next? The gods associated with war and revenge.
War and revenge. It's interesting how those themes run alongside things like love and marriage. Makes you think that the Vikings saw life as pretty complicated with all its good and bad sides.
They did. They embraced it all, the beauty and the brutality. So are you ready to meet some more intense gods?
Okay, war and revenge. It's a bit heavier than love and marriage, but definitely a part of life. And I guess a big part of Norse mythology, too.
Oh, yeah. It's all there. So where should we start? Well, how about those gods connected to love and marriage?
All right, yeah, let's stick with that theme for a bit.
Okay, so first up we have Forseti. His name kind of gives you a clue about what he's all about.
Forseti, it sounds like justice or something like that.
You got it. He's the god of reconciliation, mediation. Like, if there's a fight, he's the one to smooth things over, bring everyone back together.
So kind of like the ultimate peacemaker. I wonder what kind of arguments he had to deal with. Did Thor ever get into a brawl and need Forseti to step in?
Uh-huh. I can just imagine that. Thor with his hammer, needing someone to calm him down. But anyway, next up we have a goddess, Lufin. She's all about love, but...
About what? There's a twist.
Kind of. She's the goddess of permission, and you know what else? Impossible loves.
Impossible loves. That's intriguing. What does that even mean? Like in the world of the Norse gods?
Well, think of it like this. Forbidden love.
Yeah.
Maybe it goes against society's rules, or there's a family feud,
Yep.
or even love between a god and a mortal. That kind of thing.
Ah, I see. So Lufin represents hope then. Like even if things seem impossible, there's a chance.
Exactly. She's all about overcoming those barriers. You know, the kind that make you think, this will never work out.
I bet a lot of people prayed to her for health. You know, back in Viking times, love can be tough.
It sure can. And speaking of tough love, we can't forget about Var.
Var, who's that?
She's the goddess of oaths and vows, especially those made in marriage. So, like, those promises you make, those really matter to her. It shows how much the Vikings cared about honor, about keeping your word, especially in love.
So it's not all hearts and flowers. It's serious business. Like,
Yeah.
don't mess with Var.
Right. She represents that binding nature of promises.
Yeah.
No breaking your vows without consequences.
Ow.
All right, so there you have it. Forseti the peacemaker, Lufin for when love is tough, And Var, making sure you stay true to your word. Quite the team for this whole love and marriage thing.
They've got it covered. But love and marriage is only one side of things, right?
That's right. Now we're moving into the realm of war and revenge. Remember those themes we talked about?
Yeah, the not-so-pretty parts of life, but just as important, I guess.
Sadly, yes. So let's start with Vali. He's a bit of a tragic figure.
Tragic. How so?
His whole existence was about revenge. Specifically, avenging Baldur's death. Remember him?
Oh, yeah, the one with the mistletoe weakness?
Right. So Vali, it's like he's consumed by this need for justice. It's all he knows.
Wow, that's heavy. Like, did he even have any other emotions? Or was he just fixated on revenge?
It really highlights how powerful those feelings were after Baldur's death. The anger, the sorrow. But moving on, there's another god connected to revenge. But he's different. Vidar.
Vidar? How is he different?
He's quiet, like silent and strong. He's biding his time, waiting to avenge his father, Odin, during Ragnarok.
The silent god of revenge. That sounds pretty intense, like a volcano waiting to erupt.
That's a great image. It's interesting how both Vali and Vidar represent different ways to approach revenge. One is immediate, fiery. The other is more, well, patient and controlled.
Yeah, I get that. Different ways of dealing with those strong emotions. Okay, so we've got our revenge gods. Now, what about the opposite, like the brainy ones?
Ah, yes. The gods of wisdom and knowledge. The Vikings, they weren't all about fighting, you know. Brains were important too. So first up, let's meet Bragi.
Bragi. That name doesn't sound familiar.
Well, he's the god of poetry, eloquence, music, words, stories, art. It shows how much the Vikings valued creativity. You know, not just practical skills, but the power of storytelling, how it can move people.
Yeah, I can imagine him at a feast, entertaining everyone with his poems and songs, passing down those stories and legends.
Exactly, keeping the tradition alive. But now, for someone a bit more practical, let's talk about air.
Air. Who's that?
She's the goddess of medicine and healing. In a world full of dangers and battles, she would have been essential.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. Like, no hospitals back then, so her knowledge of herbs and remedies would have been invaluable.
Absolutely. She represents that hope for healing, you know,
Yeah.
that even when things are bad, there's a chance to get better. And speaking of knowledge, we have Saga.
Saga. Is that connected to sagas, like the stories?
You got it. She's
Yeah.
the goddess of history, storytelling. She makes sure the past isn't forgotten, that those stories are passed down.
So she's like the memory keeper, making sure the Vikings remember where they came from.
Exactly. Remembering the past, learning from it, it's all connected. And finally, for the wisdom department, we have Snotra. She's all about making good decisions, being intelligent and thoughtful.
So she's not just about having knowledge, but using it wisely.
Exactly. Thinking things through, making choices that benefit everyone. Using your brains for good.
That's a good lesson for all of us. Okay, so we've met the poets, the healers, the memory keepers, but in every group, there are always those who don't quite fit in, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. The outliers. The ones who stand apart.
And those are often the most interesting. So what does Norse mythology have for us in that department?
Well, how about Skadi? She's a goddess of the wild. Winter, hunting, skiing, mountains.
She sounds like a serious adventurer, like at home in the snow and ice. I bet she's got some amazing stories.
She does. And she reminds us of the power of nature. You know, that raw, untamed beauty. It can be awe-inspiring, but also a little bit scary.
Makes sense. Nature can be both, right? All right, what about another outlier?
Okay, how about Uller? He's all about survival. Those skills you need to thrive in tough environments.
Like Bear Grylls of the Norse gods?
Huh? Something like that. He's a hunter, archer, skier, at home, in the wilderness, in winter, very self-sufficient, resourceful.
It's interesting how the Norse pantheon has gods for all these different aspects of nature. The harsh side, too, like winter. It's like they recognize how powerful those forces were.
They did. It wasn't about conquering nature, but respecting it, learning to live with it. And you know what? That's a lesson that's still important today.
Absolutely. We could all learn a bit from that. Okay, so, wow, we've covered a lot of ground. Love, marriage, war, revenge, wisdom, even ventured into the wilderness. It's amazing how diverse the Norse gods are, but I'm guessing there's even more to discover.
Oh, there's always more. More stories, more connections, more insights into how the Vikings saw the world. It's a rich tapestry, that's for sure.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how each of these gods and goddesses, they're not just like these abstract forces.
Right.
They're like reflections of us, of what it means to be human. Like the Vikings were using these stories to figure out, I don't know, themselves and the world around them.
I think you're right, and that's what makes them so interesting even today. These stories, they're about love and loss, bravery, betrayal, all those big questions that we're still trying to answer.
Yeah, and it's not just the individual stories, it's how they all weave together, like one big epic narrative.
Exactly. Like we're putting together a puzzle, right? Each god is a piece. And the more we learn, the more we see the whole picture, the Vikings' worldview.
And it's a worldview that's not afraid to show the good and the bad, the beauty and the, well, not so beautiful parts of life.
Yeah, it's raw, honest.
Yeah.
I kind of admire that.
Me too.
Yeah.
And it's not just about understanding the Vikings, you know? It makes you think about your own beliefs. Like, what do I admire about these gods? What scares me? What can I learn from them, from their successes and failures?
Those are big questions. But that's the power of these myths, right? They make us think about ourselves, about who we are. And that's why they're still relevant today, I think.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have a question for our listener, something to think about.
Oh, I'm curious.
If you could be any Norse god or goddess, who would you choose? And why? Like, who do you connect with the most? Whose qualities, whose story resonates with you?
That's a great question. It makes you think about, well, what do you value? What kind of challenges would you face? What role would you play in this grand story?
Would you be Odin, the wise strategist? Or Thor, the strong protector? Maybe Loki, the trickster, always shaking things up? Or Freya, powerful and free?
Or maybe someone like Forseti, the peacemaker. Or Lufin, with her compassion and understanding. Or Tyr, so loyal and brave. There are so many possibilities, and each one says something about you, about who you are.
Exactly. It's a journey of self-discovery, isn't it? Using these ancient myths to understand ourselves, our own modern lives.
It is, and I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah, I agree. So that's our deep dive into the world of Norse gods and goddesses. But like we said, it's just the beginning.
There's so much more to explore, so many stories to discover. Keep digging, keep learning, and who knows, you might even meet your inner Norse god or goddess along the way.